1 Samuel chapter 14 today. We're looking at some of the first battles that Saul would fight. He's battling against the Philistines, and the people are fearful. They're fleeing away. They didn't have the weapons they needed to do battle. It wasn't looking good for the Jewish people. But Jonathan, the son of Saul, decided he was tired of hiding out, and he's going to take the battle to the Philistines. So he and his bodyguard sneak out. They don't tell Dad or anybody else. And they go into the rocks, and they hide kind of in a crevice of a rock. And then they pop out of that rock. This is in the first verses of the chapter. And they go after some of the Philistines and kill 20 of them. So it was quite the victory for Jonathan. But what this did is brought fear into the Philistines. The Philistines, who thought they had the Jews cornered and defeated, find this young man and his bodyguard doing this, and they began to think, are we being ambushed? Do they have a lot more firepower than we knew about? Are there people hiding in the rocks and in the holes of the ground? They're going to pop up and kill us? What's going on here? And so they got fearful, and as a result of that, they began to be afraid. And verse 16 said, the multitude began to melt away. So they're very concerned, very fearful. So when that begins to happen down in verse 18, Saul jumps into the battle. He wants the ark to be brought there. I'm not sure that was a great idea, but they did. And Saul and all the people who were with him rallied and came to the battle. So his forces were energized by the efforts of Jonathan. And they saw the melting away of the Philistines, and they decided it's time to go into battle. On top of that, we find that there were other Jews in the area, who saw what was happening, and they had been hiding themselves in the hills of a country of Ephraim, verse 22, and so forth. But when they heard the Philistines were running away, they jumped into the battle as well. So verse 23, the Lord delivered Israel that day. So what looked like complete defeat has now turned into a marvelous victory. But then Saul does one of his stupid things. He seems to be pretty good at that. He tells the men, maybe as kind of a vow to the Lord, Lord, if you give me the victory, we won't eat food all day. And so we have here, he makes his warriors promise not to eat any food all day. Now remember, they're fighting a battle. They're putting out all this energy and they have no food. That's a bad choice. So he tells them not to eat anything all day long. And they obey, although that seemed to infect their abilities or affect their abilities to do battle. But Jonathan hadn't heard of the band because he was out there doing his thing. And so he had actually, verse 27, he dipped his staff in some honey, and he ate the honey, and his eyes brightened. That means that they energized him. And when he heard about the band, verse 28, he said, my father has troubled the land. He was not in agreement with his dad on this. But the people, verse 31, continued to be weary. And finally, when the day was over and they could eat, they were so ravished, so hungry, that they began to eat things with the blood in them, which was not supposed to be done in Israel. They were never to eat with the blood, but they were too hungry, and so they did so. We find that Saul builds an altar in verse 35, but he then wants to know, he realizes that the Lord is not answering him. He's asked some questions of the Lord at verse 37, and whether he should go down to the Philistines, and the Lord's not answering. So he comes to the conclusion that somebody has broken his band, and he got to find out who that person is, and then he's going to kill that person. Not knowing, of course, that it was Jonathan. And one thing led to the other, and they find out it is Jonathan. And in verse 43, then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you've done. And he said, I indeed tasted a little honey. Here I am, I must die. So Jonathan was willing to die for what he'd done. And Saul was going to do it. But verse 45, but the people stood up and wouldn't let him. Jonathan was a great hero that day, and they would not let that happen. Go down to verse 47, and Saul had taken the kingdom over Israel. He fought against all his enemies on every side, and we see him defeating all kinds of enemies, but he could not overcome the Philistines. Those would become his nemesis. As a matter of fact, much later he would die on the battlefield against the Philistines. And so, and also here we have some mention of some names, a couple of his children and his army captain Abner. Those names are going to become important in the story a little later on. We'll look at chapter 15 tomorrow.